Imagine a galaxy that had been broken for thousands of years. Worlds scattered, cut off from one another, whole civilizations left in the dark, fighting endless little wars with no hope of unity. For ordinary people, life was nasty and short, filled with superstition, alien predators, and constant fear. It's in this fractured time, often called the Age of Strife, that a single figure began to step out of myth and into history. He was known only as the Emperor. No one truly knew his origin, and maybe that mystery was part of his power. He was taller than any man, stronger than any soldier, with a presence that could silence a crowd and a mind that seemed to stretch into the past and future. He wasn't just a leader. He was more like a living symbol, a man who carried humanity's destiny in his hands. The Emperor didn't step onto the stage quietly. He struck with speed and certainty. His first goal was simple to describe but impossible in scale: bring all of humanity's scattered children back together under one banner. The galaxy was full of human colonies that had lost touch with Earth long ago, some thriving, others mutated or enslaved by alien masters. The Emperor's dream was to reunite them into one vast empire, ruled not by superstition or fear, but by reason, science, and sheer will. He called it the Great Crusade, and it was nothing short of a storm rolling across the stars. To make this dream possible, the Emperor needed armies unlike any seen before. Out of his secret laboratories came warriors who defied imagination. These were the Space Marines, towering super soldiers created from carefully crafted gene seed, each one a fusion of human flesh and engineered perfection. But even they weren't the pinnacle of his genius. Above them stood the Primarchs, 20 in total, though 2 would be lost to mystery. The Primarchs were his sons, each one more than human but not quite divine, built to embody fragments of the Emperor's own brilliance. One was a master of strategy, another of speed, another of endurance, another of faith, and so on. They weren't just leaders for their legions. They were family, each tied to the Emperor in ways deeper than blood. It didn't take long for these demigods to step into legend. Each Primarch was given command of a legion of Space Marines crafted from his own genetic code, making them not only soldiers but extensions of himself. Together they were unstoppable. Imagine a galaxy of frightened worlds suddenly seeing fleets of gleaming warships arrive, filled with warriors clad in power armor, speaking of unity and destiny. Some worlds surrendered eagerly, grateful to be rescued from alien tyrants. Others resisted and were crushed with merciless efficiency. Either way, the stars themselves seemed to fall into line as the Great Crusade pushed forward. At the head of all this marched the Emperor himself. Unlike later times when he would retreat into secrecy, in these days he fought openly. Picture him in golden armor, taller than any man, his face radiant with authority, striding into battle with a flaming sword in hand. He didn't simply give orders from afar. He stood in the thick of it, side by side with his sons, inspiring loyalty not only with words but with deeds. In those moments, the Great Crusade wasn't just a military campaign. It was theater, myth, and reality rolled into one unstoppable tide. No one stood closer to the Emperor than Horus Lupercal. Horus wasn't just his son, he was his favorite, though few would dare speak the word. Horus was charisma incarnate, a leader who could command entire armies and still make each soldier feel seen. He was brilliant on the battlefield, but just as important, he could win over his brothers, his allies, and even his enemies with a smile and a word. When the Emperor looked at Horus, he saw not only a weapon but an heir, someone who might one day carry his vision forward. Their bond was so strong that in quiet moments, after battles were won, father and son would spend hours in conversation, not about tactics or strategy, but about philosophy, about humanity's future, about what it meant to rule. This bond wasn't forged in words alone. On one world, during a brutal campaign against the Orcs, the Emperor was struck down in the middle of battle, pinned beneath a massive warlord who sought to strangle the life from him. For a heartbeat, even the immortal seemed vulnerable. But Horus, enraged and fearless, charged forward. With his bare hands, he ripped the Orc's arm clean from its body and hurled the creature away. In that moment, the Emperor saw more than a son. He saw a partner, someone who would never hesitate to throw himself into the fire for him. That act sealed their trust in ways no title or medal ever could. Under this father-son duo, the crusade grew faster, bolder, more relentless. Fleets of warships fanned out in every direction, carrying the Emperor's dream like wildfire. Every victory brought new worlds, new recruits, new industries feeding the machine of conquest. Some planets were reunited peacefully, their people falling to their knees at the sight of salvation. Others resisted with fleets and armies, only to be swept aside by the combined might of space marines, imperial soldiers, and the colossal walking war engines called Titans. And still others weren't human at all, alien civilizations who had ruled parts of the galaxy for ages. Against them, the Emperor showed no mercy. Humanity would not share the stars. To those who lived through it, this era must have felt unstoppable. Picture being a citizen of some far-flung colony, hearing whispers of a great golden king, whose armies burned through the dark, bringing light and order. Imagine seeing the banners of the Imperium unfurled across your skies, hearing that humanity was no longer fractured but becoming one again. For many, it must have seemed like the dawn of a new golden age. But beneath the victories, seeds of doubt and cracks in the foundation were already forming. The Emperor called his vision the Imperial Truth. It wasn't just a political creed, it was a demand. The Imperial Truth rejected all gods, all superstition, all myths. Humanity, he declared, needed nothing but reason, science, and loyalty to itself. Priests and prophets were silenced. Temples were burned. Entire cultures had their faith ripped away overnight. For the Emperor, it was the only way forward. But for many, it felt like a hollow replacement. You can conquer a people's land with guns and soldiers, but conquering their hearts and beliefs is a slower, messier war. In more ways than one, the Emperor was building his empire on a fault line. Still, for now, the cracks didn't show. The crusade pressed on, and the Primarchs proved themselves in world after world. Guilliman, the master of governance, built entire systems into efficient machines of order. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, fought like a living storm, breaking enemies with brute force. Sanguinius the Angel inspired awe wherever he went, his wings making him look like a figure out of a dream. Each brother had his own way, his own legion, his own legend. And above them all, always at the center, was Horus, the favored son. When the crusade reached Ullanor, it faced its greatest test yet, the largest orc empire in history, led by a warlord so vast and powerful he seemed unstoppable. This wasn't a minor campaign. It was the kind of battle that could define the future of the entire Imperium. Nearly every Primarch took part, leading their legions into the fray. Horus and the Emperor devised the strategy together. A lightning strike to the enemy's heart, cutting off the head so the body would collapse. It was a gamble, bold and dangerous, but perfectly suited to Horus's style. And it worked. The Orc Empire shattered, its warlords slain, its armies collapsing into chaos. The victory at Ullanor wasn't just another triumph, it was a turning point. To celebrate, the Emperor staged a grand parade unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. Picture endless ranks of soldiers and tanks stretching to the horizon. Titans towering like gods of steel. 14 legions of space marines marching in perfect formation. And at the center, the Emperor himself, with Horus at his side, basking in the roar of billions. For one shining moment, the Imperium seemed untouchable, its destiny. But that day wasn't only about triumph. It was also the moment everything began to change. The Emperor, in front of everyone, announced that he was leaving the crusade. He had a secret project to pursue back on Terra, one that he said would shape humanity's future. In his absence, he declared, Horus would take command. From now on, his son was not merely first among equals. He was War Master, the supreme leader of the crusade. It was the highest honor, and for Horus, perhaps the heaviest burden of his life. The crowd cheered. The soldiers shouted his name. Yet in the hearts of the other Primarchs, shadows formed. Horus had been their brother, their companion, their equal. Now he stood above them all. Pride, jealousy, fear. These emotions stirred quietly, almost invisibly, but they were real. And for the first time, the Emperor was gone, leaving his sons to wrestle with their own doubts. At Ullanor, humanity saw its brightest moment. But like so many great peaks in history, the higher you climb, the further you have to fall. The seeds of betrayal, the whispers of chaos had found their soil, and soon they would begin to grow. When the Emperor left, the galaxy suddenly felt colder. The Great Crusade hadn't slowed down. Fleets still jumped from star to star. Space Marines still fought their endless wars. Alien empires still burned, but something was different. The figure at the heart of it all, the one who carried that sense of unstoppable purpose, was gone, and in his place stood Horus, the War Master. For Horus, the weight was enormous. Imagine being trusted more than anyone else in history, given command of 1,000,000 worlds, billions of soldiers, and the destiny of your entire species. Even for someone as brilliant and charismatic as Horus, that burden could cut both ways. He wore the title with pride, yes, but deep down he also carried the gnawing fear that he could never live up to his father's shadow. The other Primarchs felt the change too. Before Ulana, they had been brothers. They argued, they clashed, they disagreed, but they were equals. Now Horus was lifted above them, declared not just a commander, but their commander. Some accepted it gracefully, even joyfully. Robert Guilliman, for example, always respected hierarchy and admired Horus's leadership. But others bristled. Liman Russ, proud and fierce, didn't like bowing to anyone. Mortarion, bitter from his past, saw favoritism, and favoritism bred resentment. And even those who loved Horus, like Sanguinius, couldn't help but feel the subtle distance growing between them. It was in this shifting ground that the first real cracks began to show. And the warp, the endless howling sea of raw emotion that lay just beyond reality, was listening. In that place, the Chaos Gods stirred. They had watched humanity since its birth. They had fed on its anger, its desire, its despair, and now they sensed weakness. They knew what it meant when a father left his sons untended. They knew the sting of pride, the ache of abandonment, and the hunger for recognition. All they needed was to whisper at the right moments, to push at the right doors, and humanity's greatest champion could be turned against everything he once stood for. The first storm broke at the Council of Nicaea. The issue at hand was sorcery, psychic power. Across the crusade, the number of psychers had been rising. Some were small and weak, but others were terrifyingly strong. They could bend reality with a thought, call fire from nothing, or peer into the future. The Emperor himself had used psychic power openly, but he feared what it could do in the wrong hands. And so, he called all his sons, his generals, and his advisors to Nicaea, a glittering world where the future of humanity would be debated. The scene must have been breathtaking. Primarchs seated like gods, surrounded by their champions. The Sisters of Silence stood cold and unyielding, their very presence making psychers tremble. On one side stood the accusers Liman Russ, who saw sorcery as nothing but dishonor, Mortarion, who hated it with every scarred memory of his youth, and countless others who had seen psychers fall to corruption. On the other side stood the defenders, Magnus the Red most of all, a giant with skin like burning bronze and a single eye that seemed to see through time itself. Magnus argued that knowledge was not evil, that power itself wasn't corruption, and that only through discipline could humanity truly master its gifts. Jagatai Khan spoke in his favor, comparing a psycher's mind to an athlete's body. It needed training.
The debate raged for days, each side shouting warnings, promises, and curses. In the end, the Emperor gave his verdict. He sided with the accusers. The librarians, the psychic orders within the legions, were to be disbanded. The use of sorcery was banned. Magnus, despite his eloquence, was crushed. His entire legion, the 1,000 Sons, were built around psychic power. To strip that away was to strip away their very identity. He obeyed, but with bitterness, and bitterness in time becomes poison.
While Magnus mourned, Horus carried on the crusade. Victories still came, but the warmth of them had dulled. The Emperor was gone. His brothers grew distant. And then came the mission to the Intrex. On the surface, it was just another diplomatic mission. The Intrex were a strange human-like race, advanced in ways that rivaled even the Imperium, but suspicious of outsiders. At first, talks seemed possible. But something went wrong. An artifact vanished. An ancient blade known as the Anatheme, stolen by a word-bearer named Erebus, though Horus didn't yet know it. The Intrex believed Horus had come to steal, to betray, and war broke out. The chance for peace was burned away. That blade, the Anatheme, was no ordinary weapon. It was steeped in chaos, dripping with corruption. Erebus, servant of Lorgar and chaos itself, had placed it carefully into the story, like a chess piece sliding across the board. Soon, its purpose would be revealed. The next stage was the world of Davin. Horus, leading his forces to crush what seemed like a petty rebellion, walked straight into a trap. During the battle, he was struck by the Anatheme, the blade cutting deeper than any wound had before. It festered, it rotted. Not even the greatest surgeons of the Imperium could heal it. The War Master, beloved of all, lay dying. It was then that Erebus whispered again. He suggested that Horus be taken to the Serpent Lodge, a strange cult on Davin that claimed to heal the unhealable. In desperation, Horus's followers carried him into their temple. There, amid smoke and chanting, the ritual began. His body lay feverish, while his spirit was cast into the warp itself. And in that dark ocean of thought and nightmare, Horus saw vision. He saw the Emperor not as a leader of reason, but as a god worshipped by billions. He saw his brothers cast aside, forgotten, their sacrifices dismissed. He saw himself abandoned, his victories claimed by others, his name erased. Were these lies? Not exactly. The Chaos gods never needed to lie. They showed Horus what he feared most, what he already half believed. They twisted his doubts, his pride, his sense of betrayal, and made them unbearable. In the midst of this vision, Magnus tried to intervene. Despite his own pain, he projected his spirit into Horus's mind, begging him to resist. "Don't believe them," Magnus pleaded. "Stay loyal to our father. Don't turn away from the light." But Horus was already slipping. Erebus mocked Magnus, the Chaos gods pressed harder, and Horus, the Emperor's favorite son, made his choice. He would no longer serve his father. He would serve himself. When Horus awoke, the wound was gone. His body was strong again. His legion rejoiced, believing their War Master had been saved. But the man who rose from that bed was not the same. The whispers of chaos clung to him. His heart was twisted. He had been healed, yes, but the price was the soul of the Imperium itself. This was the turning point. From this moment on, Horus's destiny was no longer the shining path of the Emperor's heir. It was the dark road of betrayal. The fall of the War Master had begun, and with it, the galaxy would burn. When Horus opened his eyes on Davin, the galaxy itself seemed to shift. His followers cheered, thinking their War Master had defeated death itself. They didn't see the truth. They didn't hear the whispers that had clawed their way into his soul. From the outside, he was the same, confident, charismatic, radiant with strength. But inside, Horus was changed. He no longer marched for his father's dream. He marched for his own. The first sparks of his rebellion were small, almost invisible. Quiet talks with certain brothers, subtle changes in how orders were given, a careful reshaping of loyalty, turning devotion to the Emperor into devotion to the War Master. And yet when rebellion finally came, it came not as whispers but as fire. It began on Istvan III. Officially, it was just another campaign, a simple mission to crush a rebellion that had taken root on a populous, well-fortified world. Horus assembled a massive strike force, drawing not only his own sons of Horus, but also the Death Guard, the Emperor's children, and the World Eaters. On paper, it was an overwhelming army, one that would make short work of a single rebellious planet. But beneath the surface, Horus had prepared something darker. Among the legions he brought, there were still many who remained loyal to the Emperor, captains and companies who would never dream of turning against the master of mankind. Horus knew this, and so he crafted a plan so cold, so ruthless, that it would mark a point of no return. He ordered all loyal companies to lead the initial assault on the planet's surface, claiming their valor was needed to cleanse the rebellion in the Emperor's name. They deployed in droves, space marines slamming down in drop pods, bolters blazing, fighting the cultists and traitors on the ground. But while they battled, the skies above turned against them. Horus gave the order. His fleets unleashed one of the most horrific weapons humanity had ever created, the Life-Eater virus. From orbit, canisters rained down across the cities and forests of Istvan III. The virus spread faster than fire, eating through every cell of living tissue, reducing flesh and bone to a rotting sludge. Entire populations died screaming. Loyalist space marines, fighting with all their might, suddenly watched their bodies dissolve under the invisible tide of decay. The lucky ones were killed instantly. The unlucky lived long enough to feel themselves melt. And as if that horror wasn't enough, the virus was only the beginning. After the clouds of death swept the planet, Horus ordered bombardments of fire. Great storms of flame scarred the surface, igniting the remains, burning the very air. From orbit, Istvan III glowed like a second sun, its oceans boiling away, its cities turned to ash. It was extermination on a planetary scale. But the true targets weren't the rebels. They were the Emperor's loyal sons. Yet not all of them died. Some, warned by whispers of betrayal or saved by quick action, managed to find shelter. Deep bunkers, vaults built to survive even the fiercest bombardments. When the firestorms passed, Thousands of loyal space marines still lived amid the ruins. Broken, yes, fewer than before, yes, but alive, and alive meant dangerous. Among them were captains like Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children and Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus. Men who had once called Horus their lord, now forced to accept that their War Master had betrayed them. These survivors gathered their brothers and fought on, turning the ruins of Istvan de Thur into a battlefield of defiance. The traitors were furious. They had wanted a clean kill, a single strike to wipe away doubt and leave only loyalty to Horus. Instead, they found themselves dragged into a brutal ground war against the very men they had tried to murder. The Loyalists dug in, fought street by street, bunker by bunker. Their bolters thundered in the ruins, and every death was paid for with blood. The traitors sent down wave after wave, desperate to crush what remained, but the survivors refused to yield. This was no ordinary battle. This was brother against brother. Marines who had once trained together, eaten together, sworn oaths together, now faced one another with hate in their eyes. The screams of betrayal echoed through burning streets. Every clash was heavy with grief as much as rage. For the first time, the galaxy saw what the Horus Heresy truly meant. Not an empire versus rebels, not humanity versus aliens, but family tearing itself apart. For Horus, Istvan Thur was a test. Could he cross that line? Could he slaughter his own brothers, his own legionaries, the men who had once cheered his name? The answer came in fire and ash. There was no going back now. He had shown the galaxy his hand. He had shown that the War Master, the Emperor's chosen, had become a butcher. Word of the betrayal spread like wildfire. Those who escaped carried the truth. Rogel Dawn, master of the Imperial Fists, learned of Horus's treachery and swore vengeance. Across the Imperium, whispers became roars. Horus had turned. The greatest hero of humanity was now its greatest traitor. But Horus wasn't done. He wasn't careless. He knew the Emperor's wrath would come, and he planned for it. His next trap was already being laid. He sent word that more worlds had turned rebel, calling loyalist legions to muster. 6 mighty legions answered the call. They believed they were going to strike down Horus and end his revolt quickly. What they didn't know was that 4 of those legions had already pledged themselves to the War Master. The planet chosen for the showdown was Istvan V. If Istvan Thur was betrayal, Istvan V would be massacre. The Loyalist vanguard struck first. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, Vulcan of the Salamanders, and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard led their forces into the Urgal Depression, a vast killing ground surrounded by rocky ridges. At first, victory seemed possible. Loyalist troops smashed into Horus's forces, pushing them back, carving through traitor lines with righteous fury. Ferrus himself duelled his once beloved brother Fulgrim, and the two clashed with the fury of gods. But then came the second wave, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word-Bearers, the Alpha Legion. 4 entire legions that had marched under the banner of loyalty suddenly revealed their true colors. They turned their guns not on Horus's army, but on the brothers who had trusted them. Bolters roared, blades swung, and the trap closed. The Drop Site Massacre, as it would later be called, was one of the darkest days in all of human history. Hundreds of thousands of loyal space marines were cut down. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, legions broken in a single day. Ferrus Manus, brave and unyielding, was slain by Fulgrim, his head taken as a trophy. Vulcan vanished into legend, his fate unknown. Corax barely escaped with his life, leading the shattered remnants of his legion away. By nightfall, the ground of Istvan V was slick with the blood of the Emperor's sons. Entire legions lay in ruin, and Horus stood victorious. But even as loyalists died by the tens of thousands, the galaxy itself seemed to catch fire. On Mars, the Mechanicum split into civil war, half siding with the Emperor, half with Horus. A monstrous thing called the Scrap Code was unleashed, a techno-virus that drove machines insane, tearing apart forges and reactors. The great factories of humanity, the beating heart of its war machine, became a battlefield of steel and fire. For the Imperium, the blows came too fast, too heavy. The dream of unity shattered. The Emperor's vision of reason and order crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal. And yet, even in that storm, loyal sons still fought on. They swore vengeance. They swore they would not let Horus's fire consume all of mankind. The heresy had truly begun. Worlds burned. Brothers killed brothers. And at the center of it all stood Horus, once the brightest star of humanity, now the black sun around which the galaxy turned. The skies above Terra burned. For months, maybe years, the galaxy had been tearing itself apart, but now all of it came home. The traitor fleets that had once been scattered across the stars gathered in one vast armada. World after world had fallen, loyal legions had been crippled, Mars itself was in flames. All roads led to the cradle of humanity, and now the War Master's shadow loomed over Earth. Picture it. Terra, the Emperor's throne world, once the shining jewel of humanity, now braced for the greatest storm it had ever known. The Imperial Palace stretched across a continent, its walls thicker than mountains, its towers scraping the sky. Behind those walls, billions prayed, soldiers drilled, and engines roared. They all knew the enemy was coming, and when Horus arrived, he came with everything. 8 traitor legions. The Dark Mechanicum with their warped machines. Daemon hosts pouring out of the warp itself. An army so vast it could blacken the horizon. Against this stood only scraps. The Imperial fists under Rogel Dawn. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius. A handful of white scars, some Mechanicum loyalists. And the endless ranks of mortal soldiers. 2 billion men and women who carried lasguns and little else. It was brave, but it wasn't enough. Everyone knew it still. No one dared flinch. The Emperor was on Terra. His sons were here. And the walls would hold. The battle began with fire from the heavens. Horus's fleets rained destruction, pounding the orbital defenses, hammering the shields, trying to crack open the palace before his armies even touched the ground. The void itself shook with the clash of ships, as loyalist fleets fought tooth and nail to buy time. Luna, the moon, became a battlefield of steel and death. Whole sectors of the Imperial Navy were wiped out, but still the line held, if only barely. Then the landings began. Drop pods fell like meteors, smashing into the ground around the palace. Titans strode forward, their cannons splitting the earth. The air shimmered as daemons clawed their way into reality. Summoned by word-bearer sorcery, whole rivers of mortal cultists surged forward, chanting the names of their new gods. It wasn't just war, it was apocalypse. And yet, the defenders fought back with ferocity that stunned even their enemies. The walls of the palace lit up with fire. Macro cannons thundered. Titans loyal to the Emperor stood their ground against their corrupted kin. Blood Angels hurled themselves into the fray, wings flashing in the smoke. Imperial fists held the gates, their shields unbreakable, their discipline absolute. Even the common soldiers, outnumbered 100 to 1, stood firm, refusing to yield even as the ground beneath them turned to ash. At the Eternity Gate, the main entrance to the palace, the fighting reached a fever pitch. The gate itself was a fortress within a fortress, and it became the heart of the siege. Sanguinius stood there in shining armor, his wings spread wide, his presence filling every soldier with courage. Again and again, the traitors hurled themselves against the gate. Again and again, they were thrown back. The Angel of Baal fought like a living legend, cutting down champions of chaos, holding the line against impossible odds. But the warp had sent its own champions. Kabander, a greater daemon of Khorne, roared his challenge. He towered over the battlefield, wings blotting out the sun, his axe dripping with the blood of 1,000 worlds. Sanguinius met him head-on. Their duel was the stuff of nightmares and legends alike. An angel against a monster, light against darkness. Kabander's blows shook the very stones, but Sanguinius refused to yield. At last, with a cry of fury, he broke the daemon's back over his knee and banished it screaming into the warp. For 1,000 years, Kabander would remember that defeat. Yet even victories like this couldn't stop the tide. The walls cracked. The shields faltered. The defenders were pushed back inch by inch into the palace itself. The siege stretched on for 55 days, each one a lifetime of blood and fire. Whole districts of the palace were lost, retaken, and lost again. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. For every 1,000 cultists that fell, 10 more surged forward. For every daemon banished, another clawed its way through. Slowly, inevitably, the defenders were being ground down. And then, at the moment when hope seemed almost gone, Horus made his final move. He dropped the shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. It was an invitation, a challenge, a message meant only for one man, his father the Emperor. The meaning was clear. Come aboard, face me, and this. The Emperor gathered his companions, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, a handful of custodians and chosen warriors. Together they prepared for the most important battle in human history. They teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit, but Horus was ready. Empowered by all four Chaos Gods, he warped the ship's corridors into a nightmare maze, scattering the Emperor's party across its decks. Each hero found themselves alone, facing horrors beyond imagining. Sanguinius was the first to find Horus. The War Master stood in his armor, radiant with dark power, his eyes blazing with hatred and sorrow. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Horus offered his brother one last chance. "Join me, stand with me, rule beside me." But Sanguinius refused. He chose loyalty, even knowing it meant death.
Their battle was savage. The angel fought with everything he had, but Horus was too strong, too swollen with the power of chaos. Blow after blow rained down, and finally Sanguinius fell. Yet even in death, he left his mark. His last strike pierced Horus's armor, leaving a wound that would matter more than anyone could guess. His blood, his sacrifice, burned itself into the hearts of his sons, the blood angels, cursing them forever with the black rage.
At last the Emperor reached the throne room of the vengeful spirit, and there he found his greatest triumph and his greatest failure. His most beloved son stood before him, armored in darkness, and at his feet lay the broken body of another. It was a sight that would haunt even an immortal. The duel that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Horus unleashed the full fury of chaos, striking with claws that could shatter reality, psychic storms that ripped through the walls of the ship. The Emperor, wounded by love and hesitation, held back, unwilling to destroy the child he had once cherished above all others. Blow by blow, Horus drove him down, breaking bones, tearing flesh, mocking him with every strike. The Emperor's spine cracked. His arm was torn away. His eye was gouged out. Humanity's hope seemed to crumble with every heartbeat. And then, in the darkest moment, a single figure stepped forward. The stories differ. Some say it was a custodian. Some say a space marine. Most say it was just an ordinary guardsman, a man named Orlanius Pierce. Whoever he was, he saw the Emperor broken and dying, and he charged. A mortal man standing against a god. Horus turned his gaze on him, and with a thought erased him from existence. That was the moment the Emperor finally understood. The son he loved was gone. What stood before him was only a puppet of chaos. And so, casting aside all restraint, the Emperor unleashed his full power. His psychic might blazed brighter than the sun, a spear of pure light, pure will, pure love turned into fury. He struck Horus down, driving his power into the wounds Sanguinius had left, burning through armor, flesh, and soul. The Chaos Gods abandoned their champion in an instant. And in that final moment, Horus saw the truth of what he had done. He begged for death. The Emperor granted it. With one last blow, Horus was erased, body and soul, from the universe. The war was won. The War Master was dead, but the cost was beyond imagining. The Emperor lay shattered, his body broken beyond repair. Rogel Dawn found him, barely clinging to life, and obeyed his final command. Place him on the Golden Throne. There, entombed in machinery, the Emperor's spirit flickered between life and death, keeping humanity alive at the cost of his own. The heresy was over. The galaxy was forever changed, and the dream of a rational, secular Imperium died with the Emperor's mortal body. In its place rose something darker, colder, and far more tragic. The siege was over, but the galaxy didn't feel victorious. The War Master was dead, the traitor fleet scattered, but the cost was almost unbearable. Terra itself smoldered. Entire continents lay in ruins. Cities burned to ash, oceans blackened with the wreckage of ships. Billions had died. And within the heart of the imperial palace, on the golden throne, the Emperor no longer walked among his people. His body was broken, his voice silenced. What remained of him was bound to a machine, his will stretched thin between life and death, his mind locked in an eternal struggle to hold the Imperium together. Humanity's dreamer, the Golden King who once promised reason and hope, had become a corpse god. Rogel Dawn was the one who carried his shattered father to the throne. Imagine that moment, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, stoic and unbending, forced to admit that all his defenses, all his walls, had not been enough. He obeyed the Emperor's final order. He placed him on the throne, reconfigured the ancient machinery, and watched as life support and psychic conduits swallowed the Emperor whole. From that day forward, the Golden Throne was no longer a tool for secret projects. It became the Emperor's coffin. For the loyal sons, grief turned quickly into rage. Horus was dead, yes, but his legions were not destroyed. They had retreated into the Eye of Terror, a vast storm in the warp where chaos reigned supreme. Broken, bloodied, but far from finished. And so began the great scoring. The scoring was no less brutal than the heresy itself. Loyalist fleets hunted traitor remnants across the stars. Every world suspected of harboring Horus's allies was burned. Every cult was rooted out with fire. No mercy, no hesitation. Guilliman, who would soon rise to become the Lord Commander of the Imperium, demanded discipline above all else. The Iron Hands, furious at the death of their Primarch, struck with machine-like cruelty. The Space Wolves hunted without rest, driven by Russ's need to avenge the Emperor, and the Blood Angels, cursed by the death of Sanguinius, threw themselves into battles with a fury that terrified even their allies. The traitors did not go quietly. The Death Guard, bloated with Nurgle's blessings, spread plagues across entire sectors. The World Eaters, now fully enslaved by their rage, turned every battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The Emperor's children fell into madness, chasing excess so twisted it left planets as charnel houses. Fulgrim, now a Daemon Prince, reveled in corruption. Lorgar, the first to kneel to chaos, withdrew to preach in the shadows, spreading his faith like a cancer. The Night Lords' blood worlds dry, their terror campaigns leaving scars that would never heal. And the Alpha Legion, always enigmatic, vanished into misdirection, their true goals hidden even from themselves. Even as the Loyalists pushed the traitors back, the victories felt hollow. Ferrus Manus was dead, Sanguinius was dead, Vulcan was missing. Corax vanished into the void, broken by guilt. Liman Russ, after one final feast with his legion, disappeared into legend, chasing visions only he understood. One by one, the Emperor's sons faded from the stage. By the end of the scoring, the Imperium's greatest champions were gone. Only Dawn, Guilliman, and a handful remained to pick up the pieces. In the aftermath, Guilliman took command. The Imperium could not afford another Horus. The heresy had proved that even the strongest legions, led by demigod generals, could be corrupted. To prevent that, Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes. It broke the legions apart into smaller chapters, each limited in size, each independent of the others. Never again would a single man command hundreds of thousands of space marines. Many resisted, especially Dawn, who bristled at dismantling the proud legions that had stood since the Great Crusade. But the Codex became law. The legions became chapters. And from then on, the galaxy's greatest warriors fought not as armies, but as scattered brotherhoods. And then came the greatest irony of all. The Emperor, who had despised superstition, who had built his empire on the imperial truth, was now worshipped as a god. His broken body sat on the throne, silent, unreachable. His people could not see him, could not hear him, could not touch him. And so they prayed. Priests rose in power, preaching that the Emperor had never left, that he was eternal, divine. At first, the High Lords of Terra tried to stamp it out. But faith is stronger than fear. Soon the cult of the Emperor spread everywhere, until it was no longer a cult but the heart of the Imperium itself. Lorgar, the first traitor, had won in the end. The very thing the Emperor had fought against, religion, worship, blind faith, became the spine of his empire. The Lectitio Divinitatis, a book Lorgar had written in defiance, became holy scripture. And the Emperor, who once walked as a man, was now the God Emperor of mankind. For ordinary people, the heresy became a distant story, a half-remembered myth. What they saw was the aftermath, a galaxy locked in endless war. Billions conscripted to fight, die, and be forgotten. Entire worlds enslaved to the war machine. An imperium that stretched across the stars, but at the cost of freedom, reason, and truth. Where once there had been hope for a golden age, now there was only survival. The Horus Heresy did not just kill Primarchs or topple worlds. It reshaped humanity forever. It turned the Imperium into the very thing the Emperor had feared, a theocracy, paranoid, brutal, rotting from within. 10,000 years later, it still limps forward, its people worshipping a silent god, its armies fighting wars without end. And when you strip away all the battles, all the blood, all the grand speeches, what remains is this: the fall of a son, the silence of a father, and the death of a dream. The fires of the heresy did not go out with Horus's death. If anything, they spread. The traitor legions, beaten at Terra, did not simply vanish. They retreated into the Eye of Terror, that vast storm in the warp where reality itself bends and breaks. Inside, time has no meaning. Worlds melt and reform. Daemons stalk the skies. And it was here that the traitors found their sanctuary. They had lost the war for the Imperium, but in the eye they became something worse. Immortal threats fueled directly by chaos. Each legion that turned traitor followed its own twisted path. The Death Guard, led by Mortarion, had suffered during the Long War, trapped in a plague-ridden warp storm. Nurgle, the god of decay, whispered to them, offering relief from pain in exchange for surrender. They gave in, their flesh bloated, their organs rotted, their armor rusted into their skin. But they did not die. They could not die. The Death Guard became plague marines, carriers of every disease imaginable, spreading rot across the stars. What once were proud warriors became walking tombs, laughing through mouths filled with pus. The World Eaters descended into pure madness. Their Primarch Angron had always been chained by his own rage, scarred by the brutal implants hammered into his skull during his youth. With the blessings of Khorne, the god of blood and slaughter, Angron tore away the last of his humanity. He became a daemon prince, wings of bone and brass sprouting from his back. His legion followed, surrendering completely to the butcher's nails that drove them insane. They became berserkers who knew nothing but killing, charging into battle screaming for blood, slaughtering without thought or mercy. To fight them was to face a tide of red unstoppable and uncaring of their own survival. The Emperor's children fell under the sway of Slanesh, the god of excess and pleasure. Fulgrim, once a perfectionist obsessed with beauty, became a daemon prince of writhing serpentine form. His legion followed him into indulgence beyond comprehension. They sought sensations no mortal could imagine, twisting art into torment, turning music into weapons, remaking war into theater. On the worlds they touched, survivors spoke of screams that were both agony and ecstasy, of cities transformed into arenas of endless suffering. Where the Emperor's children passed, nothing pure remained. The Thousand Suns, already broken by the burning of Prospero, found refuge in Tzeentch, the god of change and sorcery. Magnus, their Primarch, became a towering daemon prince, his single eye blazing with warp fire. His legion split between those who embraced their sorcery and those cursed into nothing but dust and armor, their souls trapped forever. They became a legion of ghosts, their power immense but their humanity long gone. To face them was to fight not men but living spells. The Night Lords embraced Terra. Their Primarch, Conrad Kurz, had seen only darkness in the future, and in the end he welcomed it. His legion scattered into warbands, each one a nightmare. They attacked without strategy, without purpose beyond cruelty. They painted skies with fire, flayed their victims, left entire planets in despair. Where they struck, resistance often collapsed not from loss, but from fear. They became the embodiment of dread, proof that even broken legions could wound the galaxy forever. The Iron Warriors, under Perturabo, dug into war as siege masters. Their bitterness at being overlooked by the Emperor twisted into hatred, and in chaos they found endless fuel. They turned entire worlds into fortresses of pain, building weapons that blurred the line between machine and daemon. To assault an Iron Warrior's stronghold was to walk into a grinder of steel, blood, and endless fire. And then there was the Alpha Legion. If the others were monsters, the Alpha Legion were ghosts. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs, had always lived in secrets. After the heresy, their plans only grew deeper. Sometimes they fought for chaos, sometimes against it. Sometimes they seemed to help the Imperium, only to sabotage it later. No one ever knew their true purpose, or if even they themselves remembered what it was. To this day, the Alpha Legion remains a riddle, half traitor, half savior, and always hidden. These legions, each in their own way, carved scars into the galaxy that never healed. The Imperium, shattered and bleeding, tried to respond with the scouring, but the truth was brutal chaos could not be destroyed. It could be beaten back, yes. Worlds could be reclaimed. But the Eye of Terror was eternal, and as long as humanity dreamed, feared, and despaired, the gods of chaos would never die. For ordinary citizens of the Imperium, the age of the heresy became the age of war. No one remembered the golden dream of unity anymore. They remembered raids, plagues, and massacres. They remembered daemons tearing through reality, warbands of traitors burning their homes, and priests telling them to pray harder to the Emperor who never answered. The Imperium became a fortress, its borders always under attack, its people always on the edge of despair. And what of the loyal Primarchs? Many were gone. Sanguinius was dead, Ferrus Manus was dead, Vulcan was lost, Carax had vanished into the warp, Rust disappeared into legend, promising one day to return. even Guilliman, the man who had rebuilt the Imperium, eventually fell in battle, mortally wounded, his body locked in stasis for 10,000 years. One by one, the Emperor's sons left the stage, leaving humanity leaderless, adrift, with only the memory of what once had been. What rose in their absence was the High Lords of Terra, a council of bureaucrats, generals and priests. They ruled in the Emperor's name, but their rule was nothing like his. It was cautious, paranoid, and corrupt. They built the Imperium into a machine that functioned only to survive, not to thrive. Billions lived and died as cogs in that machine, nameless and forgotten. Their only comfort the belief that the Emperor watched over them. And so the great irony of the heresy became reality. Horus had failed. He had not toppled the Emperor, had not taken Terra, had not given Chaos its final victory. But in death he had still won something. He had killed the dream. The Imperium that rose from the ashes was not a beacon of reason or science. It was a fortress of superstition and fear. The Emperor, who had demanded his people abandon gods, was now worshipped as the greatest god of all.
10,000 years later, this is still the truth. Humanity, trapped in an endless cycle of war, still bows before a silent throne. The traitor legions still raid from the Eye of Terror. Daemons still whisper from the warp, and the grim reality remains: the Horus Heresy never truly ended. Its fire still burns, carried in every war, every prayer, every shadow.
The war was over. The traitors had fled into the Eye of Terror, and the loyalists had reclaimed what they could. But victory didn't feel like victory. The galaxy was shattered, scarred in ways that would never truly heal. And the Imperium, though it survived, was no longer the same. The Horus Heresy had ended the dream of a golden age. What rose in its place was something harder, darker, and infinitely more tragic. The first scar was faith. Before the heresy, the Emperor had preached the imperial truth. No gods, no superstition, no myths. Humanity, he said, would stand on reason alone. But after his body was entombed on the golden throne, silent and unreachable, the people could not help themselves. They prayed. They whispered to one another that the Emperor had sacrificed himself, not just as a ruler, but as a god. Priests spread the Lectitio Divinitatis, the book written by Lorga, the very Primarch who had betrayed the Emperor first. In a cruel twist, the vision of the traitor became the reality of the Imperium. Soon shrines rose in every city. Statues were carved on every world. Where once the Emperor had walked as a man of flesh and blood, now he was worshipped as the God-Emperor of mankind. His silence became proof of his divinity. His absence became a sign of his eternal vigilance. And the High Lords of Terra, seeing the usefulness of faith in uniting a broken people, allowed the cult to spread. What began as whispers became doctrine. What began as devotion became law. By the dawn of the 41st millennium, the entire Imperium had become a theocracy built on prayer, ritual, and fear. The second scar was fear. The heresy had shown that even the Emperor's own sons could fall, that even the mightiest legions could be corrupted. That truth shook the Imperium to its core. No one was above suspicion. No one was immune. The Inquisition was born from this fear, given unlimited authority to hunt heresy wherever it might hide. They could execute a governor with a word, burn a city for a rumor, or silence a whole planet if it meant preserving the Imperium. Their motto was simple: innocence proves nothing. Better a billion innocents die than a single traitor be allowed to fester. For ordinary people, this fear became their daily bread. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families whispered in secret, terrified that a careless word might bring an inquisitor's wrath. Psychers, once debated at councils, were now shackled and bound, shipped in chains to Terra, where thousands were sacrificed every day to feed the Golden Throne and keep the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon of the Imperium, alight. Without that sacrifice, humanity could not travel the stars. Billions of souls burned every year so the Emperor's light could shine. It was survival, yes, but it was also horror. The third scar was decay. The Great Crusade had been an age of discovery, of exploration, of daring. After the heresy, all of that stopped. Curiosity was dangerous. Innovation was dangerous. The Mechanicum, half crippled by civil war, clung to ritual instead of reason. Machines were no longer built with pride but worshipped like idols. To repair a starship engine became a prayer, not an act of science. Knowledge that had once driven the crusade forward was now locked away, feared, or forgotten. Humanity stagnated, its vast empire crumbling at the edges, surviving not by growth but by stubborn endurance. On the ground, for ordinary people, life was harsh beyond imagination. Hive worlds packed billions into cities of steel and smog, their lives spent in endless labor for factories they would never see the end of. Agri worlds grew food for trillions, their farmers living as serfs bound to the land. Forge worlds thundered with the sound of titanic machines, their skies forever choked with smoke. Their workers half-machined themselves. War was constant. Entire generations were born, lived, and died in trenches fighting wars they never understood. The Imperial Guard, the backbone of humanity's armies, became a machine that devoured lives. Regiments raised by the thousands were hurled into battle against orcs, Terranids, traitors, and worse. Few ever returned. On some worlds, serving in the Guard was considered an honor. On others, it was simply a death sentence. But across the Imperium, it was inescapable. Every family gave its sons and daughters to the meat grinder.
Even the Astartes, the mighty space marines, bore scars. Guilliman's Codex Astartes broke the legions into chapters, each 1,000 strong. No longer could a single commander wield the might of a legion. The hope was that this would prevent another Horus, another rebellion. But it also meant that never again would the Imperium see the unity and sheer power of its legions. The Space Marines became scattered guardians, mighty but fewer, their strength diluted by necessity.
And above it all, always, was the Golden Throne. The Emperor, who had once strode across battlefields and inspired his sons, was now silent, his body rotting but his will still burning. His mind held back the daemons scratching at reality's edges. His power kept the Astronomicon lit. Without him, the Imperium would collapse in days. With him it limped on, stagnant, unchanging, an empire of billions built on the corpse of a single man. This was the true legacy of the Horus Heresy. Not just broken legions or shattered worlds, but a transformation of the very soul of humanity. The dream of reason was gone. The age of faith, fear, and decay had begun. And yet, for all its darkness, the Imperium endured. It endured not because of hope, but because there was no other choice. Humanity clung to survival like a drowning man clings to driftwood. 10,000 years after Horus's fall, the heresy was still felt in every prayer whispered to the Emperor, every Inquisitor's execution, every battle fought against chaos. The galaxy had changed forever, and there was no going back. Magnus the Red had always been different. Among the Emperor's sons, he was the one most bound to the warp, the one who saw not just the present, but the endless tides of the future. His single burning eye seemed to pierce through the veil of reality itself. To his father, Magnus was both a marvel and a danger. To his brothers, he was often a mystery. Brilliant, arrogant, but also loyal in his own way. And yet it would be Magnus, more than almost any other, who would seal his own doom. It began long before Prospero burned. Magnus and his legion, the 1,000 Sons, were psychers to the core. Where other legions relied on bolters and blades, the 1,000 Sons wielded sorcery. They studied the warp as others studied history or engineering. To them, it was not a threat but a gift. But the warp does not give without taking. Many of Magnus's sons bore terrible mutations. Flesh twisted, minds broke, spirits burned out. Magnus believed he could cure them. He turned to forbidden knowledge, crafting spells and bargains that pushed the limits of what even a Primarch should attempt. The Emperor warned him. The Council of Nicaea had been clear: sorcery was banned. Librarians disbanded. Magnus himself had been told that if he ever dared to use his powers again, the punishment would be swift and final. And yet Magnus, in his pride, believed he knew better. He saw the dangers, yes, but he also saw the potential. He believed that only by mastering the warp could humanity ever hope to survive. He thought he was protecting his father's dream. In truth, he was tearing it apart. When Horus fell to chaos, Magnus was the first to see it. He peered into the warp, his mind reaching across the stars, and he saw his brother's corruption. He saw the War Master turning his legions, saw the shadow falling across Terra. And in that moment Magnus made his fateful choice. He had been forbidden to use his powers, but to do nothing was unthinkable. He believed warning the Emperor would justify breaking the rule. He believed his father would forgive him. He was wrong. Magnus hurled his spirit through the warp, battering against the psychic defenses the Emperor had raised around his great secret project, the Webway. In his desperation, Magnus shattered the wards. His warning reached Terra, yes, but at a cost beyond comprehension. The Webway project collapsed. Demons flooded into the Imperial Palace itself. The Emperor's dream of freeing humanity from the dangers of the warp was destroyed in an instant. What Magnus had intended as loyalty was received as treachery. His father's rage was absolute. The Emperor gave a simple order: bring Magnus to Terra by any means necessary. At first it was meant as an arrest. But Horus, already a traitor, twisted the command when it reached Lemon Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris. Russ was told not to bring Magnus back in chains, but to execute him. And so the wolves were unleashed. Prospero was a world of beauty, a planet of scholars, libraries, and learning. Its capital, Tizca, was filled with spires of crystal and towers of light, a city that seemed more dream than stone. Here, the Thousand Sons had built their empire of knowledge, guided by their Crimson King. When Russ came, he came not as a brother, but as an executioner. The space wolves descended like a storm. Drop pods smashed into the streets, bolters thundered. Chain blades ripped through scholars and warriors alike. At first the defenders thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Surely their father would not send one son to destroy another. But as the skies turned red with fire and the seas boiled, the truth became undeniable. This was no arrest, it was a purge. Magnus hesitated. For all his pride, for all his arrogance, he had never intended to fight his father's will. At first he tried to stay his legion's hand, hoping the Emperor would call off the slaughter. But the wolves gave no mercy. Civilians were cut down. The libraries burned. The golden towers of Tizca toppled beneath the bombardments. Only then did Magnus unleash his legion's full power. The streets of Prospero became battlefields of nightmare. Sorcerers hurled bolts of fire that melted tanks. Warriors chanted spells that turned reality itself against their attackers. Daemons slipped through the cracks, summoned in desperation. For a time, the Thousand Sons pushed the wolves back, showing the true depth of their forbidden arts. But the space wolves were relentless. For every spell, they answered with tooth and claw. For every firestorm, they responded with steel and fury. And at the heart of it all, two brothers met. Lemon Russ, the Emperor's executioner, and Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. Their duel was as tragic as it was inevitable. Russ was fury incarnate, a beast wrapped in armor, his blade howling with Fenrisian might. Magnus fought with raw sorcery, his eye blazing, his voice tearing holes in the air. Each strike shook the city, each clash tore the ground apart. At last, Russ broke Magnus's back across his knee. The Crimson King fell, his body shattered. The wolves pressed on, slaughtering what remained of the Thousand Sons. Tizca burned, Prospero died, and Magnus, broken and bleeding, made his final, damning choice. In his desperation, he turned fully to the god who had whispered to him for so long, Tench, the changer of ways. In an instant, the warp swallowed him. When he rose again, it was not as a man, not even as a Primarch, but as a Daemon prince. The Thousand Sons followed their father into damnation. Many became little more than dust bound into their armor, their souls trapped forever by the rubric of Ryman, a desperate spell meant to save them but which instead cursed them. Others embraced the sorcery of Tiench without restraint, their bodies mutating into horrors of flesh and fire. What had once been a legion of scholars became a legion of ghosts and monsters. For the Imperium, Prospero was a victory, a warning carried out, a traitor cast down. But in truth it was a tragedy. Another son lost, another legion damned, another wound carved deep into the heart of humanity. And for Magnus, who had only wanted to save his father from Horus's treachery, it was the cruelest twist of all. His loyalty had been mistaken for betrayal. His plea had been punished with annihilation. In trying to save the Imperium, he had only helped destroy it. The ruins of Prospero still stand silent and haunted. Its libraries are ash, its people long gone. Only the echoes remain, whispers of what might have been if pride had not blinded a son, and if wrath had not driven a father to unleash the wolves. By the time the fires of Prospero had died, Horus was already setting his stage. The War Master could not just rebel in secret forever. At some point he would need to reveal himself, and when he did, he had to make sure that only those loyal to him remained. His plan was as ruthless as it was clever. The world he chose to make his move was Istvan-Athui. On the surface, Istvan-Athui was just another rebellious world in need of the Emperor's justice. It had a large population, a proud history, and a governor who had fallen into corruption and heresy. Officially, the mission was simple: crush the rebellion and bring the planet back into the Imperium's fold. In reality, it was the perfect trap. Horus gathered his allies. The Death Guard under Mortarion, the Emperor's children under Fulgrim, the World Eaters under Angron, and his own sons of Horus. These legions still carried companies that were loyal to the Emperor, warriors who had not yet bent the knee to chaos, captains and commanders who believed in the old dream of unity. Horus could not risk leaving them alive, so he ordered them to the front. The loyal companies were told they would lead the assault on the planet. They were honored, chosen to prove themselves in the Emperor's name. Drop pods thundered from orbit, smashing into the streets of Istvan Athuri. Loyal Marines surged out, bolters blazing, chainswords roaring, as they carved through the defenders. For a brief moment it felt like any other campaign. Brutal, bloody, but straightforward. And then the skies betrayed them. From orbit, the traitor fleets launched the Life-Eater virus. Invisible clouds spread across the cities, devouring every living thing in their path. Civilians screamed as their bodies dissolved into sludge. Loyal Space Marines, strong enough to resist almost anything, found their flesh rotting off their bones in seconds. The very air turned against them. What the virus missed, firestorms followed. Great bombardments swept the planet, igniting oceans, turning forests to ash, and burning entire cities down to their foundations. It should have been the end. It should have killed them all. But not all the loyalists died. Some were warned by quick-thinking officers. Others took shelter in deep bunkers, sealed vaults built for nuclear war. When the fire and poison cleared, thousands of Space Marines still lived. And they were furious. Among them were men like Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus and Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children. Warriors who had once fought side by side with the very brothers who had just tried to kill them. Now, surrounded by ruins, they rallied their survivors. They dug in, they armed themselves, and they swore they would make the traitors pay. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Imperium had ever seen. Brother fought brother in the shattered streets of Istvan Athur. Loyalist squads clashed with traitor squads in alleys filled with smoke and ash. Once familiar war cries now sounded like betrayal. Friends who had eaten together, laughed together, and sworn oaths together now drove chainswords into each other's hearts. It was civil war in its rawest, most intimate form. The traitors raged. Horus had wanted a clean cut. Loyalists dead, traitors united. Instead, the survivors of Istvan Athuri fought harder than anyone expected. They turned every street into a fortress, every building into a bunker. They fought with a desperation that only betrayal can ignite. For months, the ruins echoed with their defiance. And as the battle raged, the true nature of the traitor legions became clear. The Death Guard unleashed plagues and toxins, filling the air with death. The World Eaters hurled themselves into combat, their rage unchained, hacking down anyone in reach. The Emperor's children, already sliding into corruption, reveled in the slaughter, turning cruelty into art. And the sons of Horus, once paragons of loyalty, became executioners for their father's rebellion. But the loyalists did not break. Again and again, they repelled traitor assaults. Again and again, they held the line, even knowing no reinforcements would come. They fought not for victory, but for honor, to prove that even in the face of betrayal, they would not yield. Eventually, the end came. The loyalists were too few, their enemies too many. Horus could not allow them to survive, not after they had resisted for so long. He unleashed the full might of his legions. Titans leveled the ruins. Daemons clawed their way into the battlefield. The survivors were hunted down, slaughtered one by one. Only a handful escaped, fleeing into the void to carry the truth back to Terra. But the damage had already been done. The heresy was no longer rumor, no longer whispers in the dark. It was open war. The greatest betrayal in history had been sealed in blood and fire. For Horus, Istvan Athur was a grim necessity, a test of loyalty. For the loyalists, it was a tragedy beyond words. And for the Imperium, it was the first time the dream of unity truly died. From this moment on, the galaxy burned not in isolated battles, but in a civil war that would engulf everything. They said the worst was past after Istvan Athur. They were wrong. The massacre, there had been a knife in the back. Istvan V was the knife twisted. Word went out across the void that Horus's first wave of traitors had dug in and needed to be broken. Loyal legions rallied hard and fast. It felt like a chance to end the rebellion in one hammer blow, to smash the War Master's forces before his rot spread any further. Ferrus Manus came with the Iron Hands, all steel will and clenched fists. Vulcan brought the salamanders steady, compassionate, brave even when the sky was on fire. Corvus Corax arrived with the Raven Guard, quiet as a storm at night, blades hidden until they weren't. 3 Primarchs, 3 legions. The kind of force that once won entire sectors in a week. They weren't walking into a battle. They were stepping into a story they thought would end with victory parades and banners in the wind. Istvan V didn't welcome them. The planet was scarred and cruel, a bad-tempered world of black stone, and air that tasted like bitter metal. The Urgol Depression, where the fighting would happen, was a huge bowl of jagged ridges and broken plains, a natural killing ground if someone was nasty enough to use it that way. The Loyalists came down confident anyway. Dropships cut through the clouds in sheets. Thunderhawks screamed low. Armor columns hammered out onto the flats and spread like a metal tide. The first waves formed ranks with the speed of old habit, banners cracking, Vox traffic tight and crisp. The plan felt simple: hit hard, punch through, shatter whatever Horus had left down here, then keep rolling until nothing of the traitor lodgment remained. At first it worked. Iron Hands slammed into the enemy with the force of a meteor. Salamanders pushed forward methodically, clearing strongpoints, dragging civilians and wounded out of the rubble when they found them, because they always did. Raven Guard flowed around the flanks like smoke, slipping through gaps, taking out artillery crews with knives and short bursts, painting Silentis on targets for close air support. The opening hours looked like a highlight reel for the Great Crusade: clean lines, fast pushes, precise strikes. Vox chatter was confident. Reports came back filled with words like secured, breached, and advancing. You could almost believe the galaxy still made sense. Ferrus saw Fulgrim in the chaos. The Phoenician flashed like a blade in sunlight, his armor too perfect for a field like this, his voice smooth over the din. Still trying to talk like brothers could settle this with a conversation. Ferrus didn't have patience for a speech. He charged. Their duel cut a circle in the middle of the war, a brutal drumbeat under the roar of guns. Gorgon against perfection. Hammer against blade. Sparks flew, the very rock shuddered, and for a heartbeat everyone nearby felt like they were watching the whole heresy balanced on the edge of a sword. While they fought, while loyal banners surged, while tanks crushed barricades under churning trades, the ridgelines around the Urgol Depression woke up. Guns the Loyalists hadn't even clocked started chewing. Artillery that had been quiet suddenly roared. Trenches they thought were empty spat fire. And then the second wave dropped. Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, Alpha Legion. 4 legions, not relief, not for executioners. They came down in perfect timing, like this had been rehearsed 1,000 times. The Iron Warriors set up killing boxes in minutes, their fire lanes crossing in neat, merciless geometry. The Night Lords didn't bother with neat. They came screaming, helmets painted like skulls, Vox amps howling, Terra rolling off them in sick waves that punched through discipline and hit the human gut. Word-bearers sang. They actually sang. Dark litanies boiling the air, summoning things that had no right to be on a battlefield of men. And the Alpha Legion were everywhere and nowhere. In Loyalist colors 1 second, vanishing the next, sowing doubt with a wink and a shot to the back of the head. The trap didn't spring with a click. It slammed shut with a planet-sized crash. Loyalists who had been pushing forward now found themselves shot from behind. Flanks that looked open suddenly spat missiles. Vox nets filled with panic cross-talk, with call signs that didn't match, with orders that sounded right but came from voices no one recognized. Ferrus's line bent. Vulcan's companies staggered. Corax's scouts vanished into smoke that hummed with demonic whispers. What had been a charge became a fight to stand upright in a hurricane of steel. Up on that brutal ridge, Perturabo unpacked an entire nightmare of siegecraft like a street magician coughing up chains. Bastions rose where there had been bare rock. Emplacements grew teeth. Minefields appeared as if they'd been sleeping there for years. Every attempt by the Iron Hands to punch through slammed into a fresh wall of ferrocrete and overlapping fields of fire. Ferrus took the hits personally, like the planet itself was insulting him. He drove forward anyway, knuckles white on his weapon haft, braced against an avalanche that didn't care how angry he was. The word-bearers made the ground wrong. They opened their books and their veins, and the air went sharp and hot. Things crawled out of nowhere, all teeth and laughter and old hunger. Salamanders answered with flame of their own, but theirs was clean, controlled, a craftsman's fire. Vulcan led from the absolute front, rallying a fortress every 10 minutes out of ruins, flipping retreats into anchors, dragging wounded to cover with one hand and snapping shots with the other. Every time his line threatened to break, he was there, steady as a mountain, voice calm, telling his sons to breathe, reload, stand. Korax saw the shape of the slaughter and tried to cut a way out. Raven Guard squads slipped into shadows that weren't there a second before, popped up behind heavy guns, knifed crews, and melted away before the return fire arrived. They marked routes with quick signs, cleared channels with sabotage, tried to turn chaos into a map. For a while it worked. Small groups broke free of encirclements. Tight formations skittered out of overlapping arcs, ragged columns found holes no one else could see. But the Alpha Legion closed the gaps almost as fast as Korax opened them, dropping counter ambushes like shutters, seeding false trails, poisoning Vox authentication. The Raven Guard were good. The Alpha Legion had planned this. Every story on Istvan V had a smaller story tucked inside it. A pair of salamanders holding a breach so long their armor fused to their skin. An Iron Hand tech marine who dragged a busted predator into position and used it as a bunker until the barrel drooped from heat. A Raven Guard sergeant who kept calling fire missions through gritted teeth, while his squad bled out around him, his last coordinates a whisper that saved 100 strangers he never met. There were 1,000 moments like that. Tiny lights in a sky that was mostly ash. Down in the heart of it, Ferrus and Fulgrim's duel hit its last beats. Ferrus, all honest fury, overhand swing like a falling meteor. Fulgrim, all speed and angle, blade flashing and singing with something wrong. When the moment finally came, it was nasty and fast. Fulgrim's weapon slid in. Ferrus staggered, shock more than fear in his eyes, like he couldn't quite believe his brother had actually done it. Then the Gorgon fell. The Iron Hands felt it like a tectonic jolt, a fracture straight through their gene-forged bones. Some went quiet. Some went feral. None fought the same after that. Night Lords cut the grief with laughter. They hunted the newly leaderless like jackals circling a wounded bull. The word-bearers raised their hymns, stepping over the bodies with polite, horrible care, faces wrapped as the air bent. Iron warriors tightened the vice again, a notch, then another, no hurry, no mercy. Alpha operatives in loyalist colors called units to the wrong grid, then dropped the pretense and opened fire. There was no single collapse. It was 1,000 small ones, each cruel and precise, until the map looked like a broken window with too many cracks to count. Vulcan kept gathering, forming islands in a black sea. He pulled the lost together, gave them walls, gave them time. He dove into the hottest fights himself, the kind of leader who made you believe you could live through the next 5 minutes just by standing next to him. For a while, he was a rumor more than a man, his name moving faster than he could, an echo telling scattered squads where to run. When the hammer finally fell on him, it wasn't in a duel that got a poet's stanza. It was a world coming down all at once, Titan fire, orbital strikes, a cliff of steel. He went under, then out of sight. Salamanders swore he'd return. Others called it denial. Later stories would say he was captured, or slain, and then not slain, because some fires don't go out the way you expect. That was Vulcan's legendary warmth, hidden under indestructible iron, the kind of hope that stubborn men refuse to let die. Korax made the choice that only he could make. He cut the last exit routes with his own blades, turned back toward the deepest pocket, and bought time with blood. He tore holes in lines that looked airtight, took squads out through gaps no one else could see, and then came back in for more as if the universe had granted him extra chances. By the end, his legion was a fraction of a fraction. But a fraction can be enough if it carries the knife home later. Overhead, the void blood. Loyalist ships fought like cornered animals. Some broke through and took survivors aboard, decks filling with oil smoke, and the iron smell of armor scored to the bone. Others died in place, proud hulls cracking, running lights winking out, names dropping off the tactical plots like candles snuffed by a careless hand. The traitor admirals didn't waste shots. They put rounds where they mattered, clipped engines, broke spines, then moved on, because the ground show was already doing more than enough killing. If you want the clean version, the one that fits on a data slate for a governor's briefing, it goes like this: 3 loyal legions landed, 4 traitor legions ambushed. The Iron Hands lost their Primarch. The Salamanders were mauled, the Raven Guard were shattered. The field was lost. If you want the truth, it won't sit still in a line or a chart. It screams over open vox. It's a squad leader counting helmets and coming up short again and again. It's a medic using his own blood to write an extraction arrow on burnt stone. It's the flicker of courage that refuses to quit even when quitting would be a kindness. By sundown, if you could call that ugly light sun, the Urgal Depression was a grave you could see from orbit. Armor burned in piles. Marines lay where they fell, black against black rock. The ground itself looked chewed. Loyalist beacons kept pinging for hours after there was no one left to answer. Traitor guns tested ranges by probing corpses with bullets, listening to echoes. Nobody learned anything new. Everyone already knew everything they needed. The trap had worked. The massacre was complete. Still, seeds don't care what kind of soil they land in, as long as it's real. In that charnel pit, a few took root. Korax got out with just enough to rebuild something that could fight again. Salamanders carried their Primarch's name in their mouths like a prayer and would not let it turn to dust. Among the Iron Hands, a hard truth cooled into iron harder than before. They were not allowed to break. Later, scattered warbands and ad hoc commands would take those tiny sparks and blow on them until they were flames. They'd call their loose alliance a Shattered Legions campaign, as if saying the word, shattered, out loud turned it into a type of strength instead of a wound. Up the chain, far from the stink of Istvan's soil, the message arrived with the quiet weight of a falling stone. 4 legions had proven false in the second wave. The War Master owned not just rebels and malcontents, but entire brotherhoods that had once saluted the same flag as the loyalists who died in the bowl. On Terra, hearts went heavier. Plans got sharper. The idea of a quick end to the heresy evaporated like breath on cold glass. And out beyond even that, in the place where the warp grins and counts, the gods that had guided Horus's hand smiled. Not because they loved victory, but because they loved the taste of endings. Istvan V was an ending of a specific sort. The end of easy faith between brothers, the end of simple plans, the end of the Great Crusade's proud stride. After that day, nothing felt clean again. You can study maps of the Urgal Depression and circle the ridges that mattered. You can list the unit designations and ammunition types. You can write down the time Ferris's pulse stopped and argue about the minute Vulcan went missing. You can do all of that and still miss the shape of it. The shape is this. The Imperium walked into a bowl believing it was about to punish a rebel garrison. It walked out, what little of it did, knowing it had to relearn everything it thought it knew about trust, about war, about the cost of being right when the whole sky is wrong.
Later, they'd build memorials. Later, they'd hang plaques and speak names and bow heads. But none of that lived on Istvan V. What lived there was a memory like a scar that still itches. What lived there was a lesson written in a language only those who've bled out understand. Sometimes the ground is not ground. Sometimes it's a mouth. And sometimes, if you're not careful, it closes.
The War Master didn't dance around his victory. He didn't need to. He shed the last shreds of pretense and moved his pieces with open hands. Whole sectors tilted toward him. Forge worlds pledged fealty to the Dark Mechanicum with prayers that sounded like code. The Night Lords turned their attention to Terra campaigns that would stain stars. The Iron Warriors dug in on planets they'd carved out of loyal territory and dared anyone to try them. The Word-bearers carried their books and their altars into 1,000 dark corners. The Alpha Legion smiled and disappeared into a fog made of lies. And the road to Terra, every mile of it lined with wreckage and regret, glowed a little clearer. Istvan V didn't end the war. It ended illusions. After that, every loyalist plan carried the taste of ash from that bowl. Every order had a shadow attached. Check the flanks again. Verify the source. Don't assume relief is relief. A whole empire learned to doubt the sound of its own heartbeat. And yet, even with all that, they fought on. Because that's what they did. Because there was nowhere else to go. Because behind all the wreckage and all the graves, there was still a golden throne and a silent figure upon it. And a light that had to be kept burning, whether it was hope or just habit now. They fought on because the alternative was to admit the galaxy belonged to the things that had laughed on the ridges that day. They fought on because of Ferrus, because of those two salamanders welded to their wall, because of a Raven Guard sergeant's last whispered grid. They fought on because somebody has to,